Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. There are events taking place right now on the political landscape which may seem minor today, but I think that these events are going to be shaping what happens for at least the next 10 to 15, perhaps longer years. The Democratic Party is going through the death throes of the old guard and was supposed to be the birth pangs of the new one, but as we all understand, nothing happens in a vacuum under white supremacy. So what we're actually seeing is a whole bunch of would-be operatives for the same old uniparty who are jockeying to see which one of them is going to be holding the whip, or as they see it, the battle for the gavel. Now, CNN conducted a poll recently, and they were basically asking Democratic voters who did they feel was most in line with the party's values, which person did they feel best encompassed that, or was closest to it. Now, when you look at CNN's list, out of the 26 names, only 4 of them are black: Cory Booker, Jasmine Crockett, Al Green, and Barack Obama. What I consider to be of note, though, is that this poll also includes results from the same question that was put to voters back in September of 2017, which was the first year of the Trump administration. And when you look at the results of that poll, you see that when those voters were asked whose vision best reflects the party's core values, Barack Obama, former president of these United States, and the guy who was most identified as the most influential and important Democrat in the country, only polled a pathetic 18%. There were more people who responded that they had no opinion about who reflected the party's core values than to claim that Barack Obama did. That lets you know just how badly he was doing when it came to Democratic voters, how poorly they looked at him. Alexandria Cortez wasn't even on the list at that time. And to me, that's what's truly important here. When you look at the difference between where Barack Obama stood 8 years ago and where he stands today, his credibility with Democratic voters has absolutely cratered. But my point is that if you want to know why Jasmine Crockett, of all people, keeps pulling her asinine little stunts, it's because she's trying to raise her name recognition and, she hopes, increase her chances of making it to higher office. As she sees it, all of this guffawing and all of this buck dancing she's doing is going to pay off in the end, because the people who she's really looking at as her constituency are not the Democratic voters, certainly not the black voters of her district in Dallas. As she sees it, her true constituency happens to be the Democratic Party donors and the white media. That's who she wants to get the support from. And you have some fools and shills who want to try to tell themselves that Jasmine Crockett, you don't know what you're talking about, Professor Truth, she's for black folks. But when you listen to her, she talks about the same pet issues that the Democrats have always championed: abortion, immigration, and some loose talk about the environment. So, while the orange man is giving jobs to apartheid rejects and wiping his wrinkled rump with the Constitution, Democrats are showing what they really care about: jockeying for position. When the Republicans were out of power for the better part of 50 years, they understood that the Democrats were doing a much better job than them when it came to marketing their political platform to the American people, starting with FDR's New Deal and continuing with LBJ's Great Society. Newt Gingrich understood that a cult of personality like Ronald Reagan simply wasn't going to be enough for the Republicans to be able to seize power and hold it. What the Republicans were going to have to do was basically take a page from the Democrats' book. After all, if you can't beat them, you might as well join them. So that's when Newt Gingrich came up with the so-called Contract with America. It was kept simple, only 10 little talking points, and it was largely things that voters were mostly in favor of. And Newt Gingrich's sales pitch to America was, if the American people put the Republicans back in control of Congress for the first time in 50 years, then they were going to do all this stuff. Of course, as we all knew, predictably it turned out to be more sizzle than steak, though it did give Joe Scarborough his first and last job in the federal government. But the point happens to be, if you're truly trying to make sure that you elevate your party to true power, at some point you're going to have to actually address what the party platform is. And if you're not getting voter support, it's probably because they literally have no clue what you stand for. A bunch of empty talking points and word salad like Kamala Harris pulled, that ain't gonna cut it. Now, you can try to get by with a cult of personality if you find somebody who happens to be particularly charismatic or attention-getting. Democrats made a habit out of that for the better part of 50 years. John Kennedy, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton, all of these examples of individuals who were charismatic politicians, but who in the end didn't do very much. And Barack Obama, of course, I think is probably the most recent example of this trend. But Trump happens to be the Republican version of it. That's the reason why Ronald Reagan, senile codger that he was, managed to get the presidency and hold on to it. He won 2 landslide elections because at the end of the day, he was more interesting than the people that he ran against. But that's not going to work for the Democrats, not this time around, because so much of their own base has soured on them. The Democrats are going to have to do something that they have refused to do for the better part of 30 some odd years. They're going to actually have to submit a policy slate to their voters, and that slate's going to have to look like what the voters are saying, not the Democrats who are trying to figure out how do they BS their way past the voters with an avalanche of gibberish. Trump was able to retake office because he galvanized his base. Meanwhile, Democrats have been steadily ignoring their own and making a show out of their contempt for their own voters. Democrats have long flirted with being the party of big business, but starting 30 years ago and the last 15 years in specific, they went from flirting with big business to just outright consummating the relationship. And you have the left-leaning portion of the white media who have been trying to define anyone to the left of Nancy Pelosi as being far left, when the reality is what constitutes the so-called far left in America would simply be left anywhere else in the world. There is no widespread or influential socialist movement in America, but there are in other countries. In fact, other countries have whole political parties that openly call themselves socialist. All of your alleged far leftists in the U.S. are still dedicated capitalists. They believe that the U.S. should have the upper hand in all international dealings, and in a dozen other ways, they share the same ideological values as the right. What we're seeing now is history repeating itself. You've got organized money who have seen how things are trending, especially among the young. Your white media are mouthpieces for established white power, and as I've always told you, the white media isn't in the business of entertainment. They're in the business of mind control. So when they see the young in danger of making a serious break with the social order that they depend on, they'll do everything they can to make the young people stop. There has begun, at least on the periphery, a debate about Democrats passing the torch from the older generation to the new generation, a changing of the guard among the Democratic leadership. Well, we've been here before, too. When Barack Obama was being pushed and promoted to the public back in 2004, we were told that he was the vanguard of a new young generation of Democratic leaders, and that the Bill Clintons and the Joe Bidens and the other old guard, well, they were just going to have to take a step back and go ahead and resign themselves to obscurity. But, of course, as we all know, what happened next was, after Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton immediately ran for office. And then alongside her was Bernie Sanders. And then Joe Biden, who at this point had lost half of what passed for his mind, he ran for office in 2020. Looks like the old guard wasn't going anywhere, and they were being endorsed by Barack Obama. And then you still got Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and nigga Jim Clyburn in Congress. The same cast of characters who screwed everything up in the first place. But as I said, after Trump won re-election, it will do the Democrats no good to pass the leadership, quote-unquote, over to tools like Hakeem Jeffries or Gavin Newsom. These guys are literally on the payroll of foreign interests like AIPAC and domestic oligarchs like Zuckerberg, Musk, and the rest of the Silicon Valley mafia. When Nancy Pelosi first got into politics back in the 70s, people said similar things about her being a young, transformative new generation of Democrat. But she quickly showed that she would just be more of the same. And I think it goes without saying that the same goes for Alexandria Cortez. If these people were actually going to rock the boat, the Democrats would have already had them primaried out a long time ago. What the white media is trying to do is to condition people to think that these stale career politicians like the Hakeem Jeffries and others are some sort of new blood. And yet they want to clearly define that this new blood isn't going to do anything new and that the voters are wrong for expecting anything different. They have to continue the same old practices that brought the Democrats to the sorry state that they're in today. The country is more than ready for a populist revolution, like the kind that the country had in the late 19th century when the anti-monopoly laws drove the robber barons from power, and then the even greater revolution during the 1930s with FDR's New Deal. But the Democratic Party of today is far more hostile to the working class than it was in FDR's day, and that's saying something. Roosevelt had been governor of New York, and his family had close ties to the banking industry naturally. That's the reason why he chose the Dulles brothers to help him move huge amounts of money around. But as stale an establishment as FDR was, he would be considered a far-left radical by the white media compared to the compromised Democrats of today. The problem isn't that there's some far-left radical fringe that's costing the Democrats elections. In fact, the problem is the opposite. Those far-left fringe elements are the very ones who handed Democrats total control of the government in 2020. That's the only way that the Democrats are going to have power. The problem, though, is that these young people are beginning to drift away from the positions that established power wants them to hold on to. So the white media is trying to convince them that America hates them, hates what they stand for. Oh, you guys, America really doesn't like you guys. You guys, you're no different than these Trumpists over here. Keep in mind, this is the same white media that tried to draw false comparisons between Malcolm X and the Ku Klux Klan. They always do that. Whenever there's a black person who's not saying, oh, massa, we don't mind you beating us upside the head, then they say, oh, you're no different than the Klan. The only ones who don't like what it is that the young people are doing are the Bill Maher's, the Jim Clyburns, and the Nancy Pelosi's. These are people who have spent their entire lives getting little envelopes from donors in the case of Nancy Pelosi, or in Bill Maher's case, relying on equally racist white media executives to give them a job. Their only goal is to preserve a dirty system that they depend on for every crumb of their daily bread. How can anyone claim that the young people who are in the streets and on the campuses demanding change have anything in common with the violent racists who overran the Capitol? It just goes to make my point. The white leftist media doesn't see Trump and the radical right as the enemy, because the people who own and control and make money off of the white media, they also benefit from the exact same system of white primacy and white economic control that the white right demands. There may be some minor rhetorical differences between some of the things that they claim to stand for, but when it comes to actual policy, they're on the exact same page. And when it comes to the white leftist media trying to tell you what America really wants or what is or isn't correct, keep in mind, this is the same white media who said Donald Trump was going to lose the election, and they were wrong 2 out of 3 times. They're not telling you what the truth is, because that's not their job. They're telling you whatever is expedient to their interests. There has never, ever been any social, political, or economic movement that has been beneficial to black people that the white media has ever said was popular or supported by the American people. They always say, well, whatever it is these black people are agitating for, America doesn't really want it. It's going to be an election loser for you. The country will turn on you and burn you at the stake if you actually try to implement any policies that are beneficial to black people. Be it the end of chattel slavery, the white media said no one supports that. The end of Reconstruction, the white media claimed that that was popular. Lynchings, the white media were cheerleaders for it. They always justified it, including the New York Times. When the civil rights movement began, there was polling about everything from the Freedom Riders to Dr. King's March on Washington. The white media reported on how well those things were polling with the public. And what a surprise, according to the white media, America hated black people fighting for our rights. Everything that we were doing, America hates. They said the same things about reparations and the BLM protests too, remember? And they're always wrong. The things the white media claims are so unpopular come to pass, and it turns out they were nowhere near as unpopular as the white media claimed. If you didn't know better, though, you'd swear the white media and their Negro bootlicks were actually putting out propaganda simply meant to demoralize you and convince you not to rock the boat. After all, as the old saying goes, the only thing required for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And when you look at all these safe Negroes who the white media puts in front of you, be it Barack Obama, Jim Clyburn, or Jasmine Crockett, none of them's trying to rock the boat. None of them is coming along and trying to be a transformational leader. See, the white right, they created that phrase as a way to say, let's transform the country back to the 1800s. That's what they see as transformational. Who is going to be the 21st century version of FDR? You don't see any Democrats trying to do that. All of them are sitting here trying to put together their own cult of personality. They're not trying to be for the American working class. They're simply trying to be against Trump, against MAGA. This is tone policing going on here, not an actual political agenda. And when you look at how these white media outlets pay their on-air shills millions of dollars, you see why it is that they're saying that anyone who wants to buck this trend, why, you're just a far leftist radical who the party needs to purge. You're the enemy. So as the MSNBCs and CNNs and New York Times see it, ultimately they have far more in common with Trump than they do with the decent young people who are demanding that power and the money has to now change hands. Now, as the black grassroots, we have to make sure to maintain our focus. You have people on the white left who are scheming ways to insinuate themselves into power. Oh, they look at the current status quo. As far as they're concerned, they want it to change, all right, but they want it to change in a way that is going to maintain their position at our expense. We must speak for ourselves, and a huge part of that process is we have to call out, to denounce, repudiate, and ultimately drive from office the tethers who are out here, pretending that they represent us when they don't represent us at all. The white right made up their minds a long time ago that they were going to be the party of radical extremists, and that's the reason why, whether they're in power or whether they're not, they always say the exact same thing. We got to get rid of these heretics. For the white right, it's never the wrong time or the wrong place for them to be trying to purge anyone who disagrees with the most extreme form of their party ideology. Democrats, on the other hand, it never seems to be the right time for them to start embracing and including individuals who put them in office, especially if what they're saying is not in line with what the party wants. And to bring this morning's briefing full circle, I mentioned earlier how there is nobody in the Democratic Party who wants to be or is even mentioning the idea that there should be a 21st century version of FDR. And keep in mind, FDR was no great shakes when it came to black Americans. One of the earliest known recordings for the White House taping system was a conversation between FDR and then head of the NAACP, Walter White. Walter White was reminding President Roosevelt that the black vote had actually broken ranks from the Republicans, the so-called Party of Lincoln, and actually did something at that time which was thought to be unthinkable. They supported a Democrat to be president. And White reminded FDR that the black vote didn't give him their support as charity. They did it because they expected their support to be rewarded through policy. That's how it works in so-called democracies. Whether you give a certain candidate money or give them your vote, in either case, you're not doing it for free. You are expecting to be repaid through policy. FDR, of course, gave Walter White all the excuses in the world for everything that he couldn't do, and that became the pattern for the Democrats all the way up until the 1960s when black people took things into their own hands. So even if you do have a 21st century version of FDR, I'm not saying that he's going to be some sort of saint. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. Even the minor lip service that FDR pretended to give is too much for Democrats. That's what needs to change. We know exactly what the Democrats' game plan is going to be. Same thing that they did the first time Trump was in office. They're going to be trying to scare voters to the polls, but specifically scare them to the polls for nothing. No matter what it is you demand, it's going to be, you can't be making any demands. It's too dangerous. We got to get Trump out of power. Why? Fascism is now descending upon the United States. Yeah, there's such a big threat. The end of democracy in America. And what do we lose? Well, you won't be able to choose anything. Policies are just going to be enforced on you and you'll have no say. Well, what are you going to do for us if we vote for you? Not a damn thing. Now go ahead and vote for us. And this is what the white media and the Democrats tell us is supposed to constitute some sort of alternative to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. This is supposed to be democracy. Democracy is when the people say this is what we want. When you look and realize that the largest voting bloc happens to be the people who want these certain specific changes to be made in the society. And then you got one political party who claims that they represent these people. And yet they say, we're not doing any of that. That doesn't win elections. They'll lie to your face and tell you what they're not going to do. I don't care how many headlines or lead stories the white media puts out trying to pretend as if the Democrats are fighting a struggle for the soul of democracy in America. Black people have never enjoyed democracy for a single instant in this country. If there was democracy in America, the headlines would have to be, democracy finally comes to the United States. But there can be no democracy in this country until black people have gotten what we are due. And the first thing that we are due is to be listened to and obeyed. I could care less whether the Democrats are having double knockouts with each other in the Oval Office or whether Jasmine Crockett and Hakeem Jeffries are having a celebrity death match on the floor of the House. This is not about them. This is about what we're supposed to be getting. There is no great fight for American democracy that's taking place. It's the same old jockeying for power that it's always been. No matter how they try to glorify this exercise in political narcissism, at the end of the day, they know all they're really doing is just changing the deck chairs on the Titanic. And in the end, they're still going down. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. James Porter, Tyrone Jones, Sean, Darren Nooks, and Bobby Williams. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.